Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and this is the second part of my retrospective of my book An Heir to Murder. In this video I am going to be talking about the final 160 pages as well as answering some questions that I got over on Instagram. I will be going more in depth, I will be rambling a lot. I'm really not sure what I've said in this video because it's been a long time since I recorded it and I really do need to get better at editing things. But for now, here is part 2. It's been good to promote more memories of everything that went into this and remind myself of some of the things that changed with editing. And it was also necessary because I have reminded myself of aspects of the story that are going to not be solved here and the loose ends that are going to be picked up in future books. However, before we start, I continued to document on a tally chart how many beverages were consumed, what meals were consumed in this book. The beverages comes from when Ros of Skellydandling about the books mentioned the amount of Pinot Grigio that Alice consumes. In particular, there is one scene after Alice and Marmaduke have a huge falling out where Alice goes home and the next day you discover she actually consumed 6 bottles of Pinot Grigio that evening. I can remember the first time I ever properly got inebriated was at my cousin's wedding in 2012 and nobody around my table liked the wine, and I probably don't do what people ought to do when they don't like wine. I just neck it and get rid of it, and if you ever want to know how I feel about a drink, if it's gone straight away, then chances are I really didn't like it and I just wanted to get rid of it. Because of this, everyone on my table handed me their wine and I necked about 11 glasses of wine in a very short amount of time, having never drunk to excess before. In the meantime, I also consumed however many Jack Daniels and Cokes. I can't remember now. So I can remember thinking that all these different bottles of Pinot Grigio, it can't be that much. But yeah, after 6 bottles of Pinot Grigio, I really think that Alice would definitely be vomiting other than what we get, which is her just sprawled out of an armchair against the front door. I do maybe question, maybe she just has a high alcohol threshold. She's also been filling herself up on full English breakfasts in this book. Let's just have the full run through of how many drinks were consumed in the 260 pages of An Heir to Murder. We had 11 bottles of Pinot Grigio, 4 large glasses of Pinot Grigio, 3 green teas, 2 lattes, 2 Americanos, 28 cups of tea, 6 cans of John Smith's, 1 decaf coffee, 1 glass of milk, 6 cappuccinos, 1 flat white, 2 glasses of water and 2 hot chocolates. All spread out through a variety of cast members. Then we have the food. So a comment from Brian or Bookish that he says he liked from this book was that Alice just eats and doesn't really care or pay attention to her weight much. I have notably always been fat, entire life sort of thing. So I perhaps wasn't necessarily thinking about what Alice was eating either. When I was younger, I know there was a really big problem for me where, you know, like the doctors are trying to force you to do all of the calorie counting and everything, and from a very young age you're getting told that you're unworthy because you're overweight. They even tried the whole thing of shaming you when you went to any doctors or anyone in the NHS, telling you that you wouldn't find a girlfriend if you were fat, so why wouldn't you try and lose the weight? And yeah, they were telling this to like a 10-year-old. So when it came to this book, it was really a big thing of mine that I didn't really want to focus on weight too much. And also I felt like food and the foods that were being eaten were very representative of what was going on. Now, I will say, like, from this, what gets eaten in this book, I also question, was I feeling the effects of becoming a vegetarian? Because this was the first year I'd been a vegetarian. And so I was just like throwing all these things in there. Also not really thinking about how many days had actually passed in this. So throughout the course of this book, 9 full English breakfasts are consumed between Alice and friends. 5 of them happen in one chapter, so I forgive them really because that was 5 different cast members. There is a salad, there is mention of Alice's mother having another halloumi salad, but that doesn't happen. There is also Alice having steak the start, with onion rings and chips and all that. You have 2 bourbons eaten, and I couldn't actually figure out how many biscuits were eaten in this scene because they were all just nibbling on them after meeting Marmaduke. They went to her parents for an Indian takeaway. 3 chocolate hobnobs were definitely consumed. I don't know how many petit fours were consumed. When Alice gets hungover, she awakens and eats enough toast to feed an entire scout hut. I don't know how much that is. She makes an apple crumble while she's worried about something, but it doesn't say whether she eats it herself. She, her mother and Jez get through a box of Ferrero Rocher, and right at the end there is a Victoria sponge. Also, we have mention of how aggressive Alice was. So just know 2 punches are thrown. She throws some things at some people, and there are 2 slap cases of her slapping people. So yeah, Alice is aggressive and she's a bit of a drinker. I knowingly set out to have Alice be a bit like this because when I was first writing this crime novel, when I was about 12 or 13, I purchased one of the books by the people who do the Writers and Artists Yearbook, which is a guide to crime writing. And in that, it's always talking about the grizzled detective from, well, history really. I think that in the 80s and the 90s, this type of detective, this man who is haunted by his demons, and he's drinking his whiskey in his office and hiding his bottle, and he's got this case of alcoholism and he's got his demons in his past. And I just thought, twist the narrative a bit. I'll go into more depth with a question I got asked by Kate Howe, but I really did want to change the story and like take this, what we've commonly associated with men, and do something like an alternative with a young female character as opposed to the older grizzled person. We finished on page 100, so I think I'll go back to there and find the notes, the first few notes I made. So the first note, I'll have to read upside down. I didn't make notes for 20 pages, was that I'd mentioned Violet Grey and Doug Grey, who are antagonists in the Our Doris series, and then I reference a fight between Doris and Edith by sharing some notice from the Partridge Music Gazette. And that was something that I'd been planting for a while in Our Doris, and Indisputably Doris is reference to the fact that Doris grew up with her uncle, her aunt and uncle, and her cousin Mavis, as opposed to her parents and her sister. And I didn't want to really reference that in the Doris books because the Doris books were mainly and are mainly comedies. And I wondered whether it was too much of a dark subject. I also liked Harold and Doris are going to keep things from the reader really because they're kind of trying to give off a certain impression. So you get the mention on the second page of Our Doris that Doris's mother drank that much, it was a wonder she could leave the house on the glorious 12th. In here, I talk about the fact that Doris's mother was a woman who got sent to prison for alcohol-related crimes, and the fight at Greenfields Hall also gets referenced either in Our Doris or Indisputably Doris, I can't remember which one now, and here you get to see what actually happened, and Mavis references it directly. Also, what I should note is that when I was writing these books, I'd originally got a plan for An Heir to Murder when I was writing Our Doris, and believed that this was going to be the next book that I wrote. So there are a lot of things that I'd intended to plant in the Our Doris books that would pay off in An Heir to Murder, and that fight was one of them. I didn't know that I was going to be using Greenfields when I set out to write Our Doris, and there were characters that were appearing in other things. So like in my radio play that I wrote at the start a decade ago now, Alf and Edith are characters, and their grandson Martin was a main character in that series, and you get to see Martin and Bev in here, but obviously the reader doesn't know that the Bev and Martin we see in here are related to Alf and Edith who we meet in Our Doris. I know that. If you've read my books and you see like a hint, so sometimes there'll be sentences in here that I know how they connect to Our Doris, and reading them I was like, oh yeah, this connects to that, but I don't know whether my readers are going to connect that. It's just in there for me to kind of like give me a placeholder, but I don't know whether anyone else is going to make that connection, but if they do, it's fantastic. Oh, at the start of chapter 14, I finally give an idea of what Shakespeare Avenue from the Doris books looks like, and I used the phrase painfully middle class, and I stole that from my friend Lindsay when she first reviewed Our Doris, and she used that phrase to describe them. I was like, I want that. And then when she was critiquing the book for me as a beta reader before I asked Dane to edit it, she brought it up. I stole it and she didn't know I'd stolen it because she didn't recognise it as her own words. Now, I can't remember who brought this up. I can't remember whether it was Dane in his editing or one of the beta readers, but basically there is a line when I'm talking about Doris and Edith, and I wrote they've been friends since dolls' houses, and someone disagreed with the grammar in that sentence. And I know with Dane, he went through a lot and changed where things got too northern and it was too much of a dialect issue, or it wasn't correct grammar, because as my friend Lindsay is wont to tell me, although some things are said in a certain type of way in the north of England, they aren't necessarily the correct grammar and spelling. And so Dane went through and changed that. But being friends since dolls' houses was one thing that I wouldn't change. It sounded correct in my head. It had the syllables for the humour, and sometimes you're going to disagree. And as the writer and publisher of these books, I can make these decisions, and if other people don't like them, it's my own fault. But friends since dolls' houses sounded correct and is something that always sticks in my mind. Also, things that got cut from this that I might have mentioned in my making of video from last year is a simile about someone with shoes so shiny that you'd be surprised to find a crease down the middle on a night out. That was me being my dirtiest, and it basically came from once my father made a joke about why men used to go out dancing with very polished shoes. It was to look at women's skirts and see whether they got any knickers on or not. And another thing that I cut was someone looking as shocked as if they'd been flashed down a ginnel. Some people didn't understand what the word ginnel was, and some people didn't understand what I was saying with being flashed down a ginnel. So I just got rid of the line entirely, because if they're not getting the joke and if enough people aren't getting the joke, then I'm just going to cut it out of there. But yeah, this was the time that I got my most smutty. Oh, which is good when we come to the next thing, which is for me to mention the lack of swearing in my books. This actually goes back to the very first Doris monologue, before it was a Doris monologue. It's at the back of Our Doris, and it's called Bread. If I was to do that nowadays, I'd probably remove some of the fat shaming stuff, but I wasn't thinking about this at the age of 18 when I wrote it. And I never knew that this was going to turn in to Our Doris and Harold. I don't even know whether I'd heard Alan Bennett at the time. But when I first wrote this, it was called Bread, and we'd been told that we had to have something written for uni. And I used to arrive at uni for my 11 o'clock class. Someone I knew who lived on the street over would go to uni on the same day as me, and so I'd get a lift. And so I'd arrive at uni for about 8 o'clock and not have a class for 3 hours. I went in once just to get some writing done, and I wrote this monologue for the class. And it wasn't originally Doris and Harold, they had different names, and it was only when I was putting Doris together I found it, and I was like, oh, this was the beginnings of Harold and Doris, and I included it in the Mac Writes anthology that came out 9 years ago, and I performed it whenever I went to perform somewhere about Doris. I upset vegans with it. That's one thing that this book would definitely do. I noticed that there's a lot of meat eating in here. It'd be very easy to offend a vegan. The swearing thing. So I wrote this monologue called Bread, and originally there was the phrase about a stupid carnivorous twat, and there was swearing in it. My tutor at the time said it didn't necessarily have the voice of someone who swore. I'd referenced age, and at the time I was like, well, it fits, but obviously wanting to get the mark, I changed it. It came to writing Our Doris. Now, when I wrote any of the Our Doris things, I was aware that I was having to perform them in public spaces. And in public spaces, there was a lot of times when there were going to be children around and we were getting told we weren't allowed to swear. So I was constantly having to change everything I was writing or had written to remove swear words from it. I recognised that my target audience were perhaps older, and I've just skipped over an entire part. So what this tutor told me back in the day was that swearing is fine in fiction as long as it fits the voice and it isn't gratuitous. And I realised that oftentimes it would change the narrative. It would pull me out of the story when there was a swear word in there. And then over time, as I was like having to perform and change things anyway, it became more fun to find alternatives to swearing. What the heck became a big thing. I never really wanted to offend anyone who might be religious reading my book, so it became taking the Lord's name in vain or oh my Lord, that sort of thing. I suppose, like, I still go back to Our Doris, and in the first chapter of that, Our Doris is bloody, and that seemed to be like the most, the strongest of swear words that I would use in my book is bloody, and even now it sometimes pulls me out of the story. And I don't mind swearing in books. Indeed, I think that should I in future, write something perhaps maybe a bit more literary, I don't know, then there might be swearing in there. But for the most part, I have made a conscious decision not to have swearing in my books, which is weird when I think about the fact that I do swear a lot at home, but it just didn't seem fitting to Owl's voice in Doris. It didn't seem fitting to the voice in An Heir to Murder, and I do kind of get some fun out of finding alternatives. And I hate to say that my tutor was right when she said about swearing being somewhat gratuitous in the context of what I'd used it. I do now find it much easier to seek out an alternative, and I've yet to find somewhere in a Doris book or in this book where it would seem fitting for a character to swear. This one I didn't know whether to mention, which is again to do with Jez and Ben. And it was Ben working late the night before. So we don't meet Ben at all in this book. I know that earlier in this previous clip I talked about having a worry about perpetuating a heteronormative happy ever after on these characters because they are now married, they are living together, and the next steps in like a heterosexual relationship would usually be like trying to have children and building a life together. Another issue I had with this was the worry that I wanted to show that a man and a woman were able to just have a friendship with each other. I do also then have this worry about the fact that there aren't a lot of female friends of Alice's featured in this book. A lot of worries there. But the Ben working late the night before is a bit of foreshadowing, really, a hint as to his career. I was going to maybe spoil that, but I think I'll wait until I actually write the thing rather than spoil it. But anyone who knows me can probably guess what Ben is doing, and I'm pretty sure I either told Emily of No Val Novels or Charlie Brooke. And then the final thing I have in here is, it was just that when they go to the police station and Detective Inspector Clive Constable is there and Alice confronts him, it's one of the favourite confrontations I ever did write, and I'd forgotten it was in here when I was reading it, and I really enjoyed myself going over it and rereading it again. Strange. It's been weird to revisit the book, really, because it's been over a year really since I'd read it. I never got the opportunity, apart from on launch nights, to read sections, and then I did a bit of a reading on YouTube last year, but otherwise I haven't gone back to it. And although certain scenes are in my head, I would almost forget the placement they came in the book and how we reached that destination. It's been good for me to revisit because it's meant that I got to see what the characters were up to, what things I'd planted for future stories, and how the characters got on with each other. At the same time, I'm sat here now thinking about all the future books I've got planned, thinking, how the heck am I supposed to write them? Which I suppose is a good problem to have. I feel like it's been a very long time, but hopefully when it comes down to it, because the characters haven't left my mind, hopefully I'll be able to write my way back in. I know most of the main plot points of the next book. I just don't know the bits that connect them. Nor do I know the ending, because something that I really would like to do is perhaps not have a similar ending, because in my head all that Alice does when she perhaps solves a murder and finds a murderer is just to hit them, can't have her going around hitting everyone. It is something that going forward I would perhaps like to change a bit, is maybe Alice's aggression, but then is it her aggression that really makes her who she is? I mean, I was reading this confrontation earlier today, and whilst I was reading it I was reminded that once I'd got my friend Joy to read it, she said that she thought that I reminded her a lot of Alice. It's like, I did not put myself into this book. It's like, if anything, she was based much more on my sister. And then she's like, no, I saw you in there. I was like, well, maybe in the anxieties that Alice feels, yeah, because, I talked about my anxieties of being at a certain age, seeing friends getting married and all of this stuff. But I was like, you don't need to call me out like that. Like, I don't go around attacking people, but maybe I am just as mean as she is. I don't know. I did actually get some questions. I asked the questions on Instagram if anyone who had read An Heir to Murder had them. Firstly, I got a question from Emma of Emma Rosen Books, she was wondering why so many of my characters are elderly, and it was an aspect of my books that she likes. Very kind. Again, this was a somewhat conscious decision years ago. So I mentioned how An Heir to Murder came about because I wanted to write a book with older characters when I was 12 years old, and then over years it never really happened. And then I wrote Our Doris. Now, Our Doris was an accident. I never really saw it becoming a book, and I talk about that all the time. Last of the Summer Wine is one of my favourite TV shows. There's, and most of the comedy of Roy Clark features older characters. I'm often told that when I was a child, I never really wanted to be around other children. And it came from having so many older relatives and knowing so many people who were in their 60s, 70s and 80s at the time. We were always around them. We were a very close-knit family when I was much younger, constantly in and out of each other's houses. I've always been inspired by the older female relatives that helped to raise me. I was seeing something in Hollywood, in films and in media, where it was as though an older person was only really featured if they were doing something outrageous. It was always for comedic effect. Now, yes, I'm writing comedy, but I still wanted there to be heart to it, and I still wanted to show that these were real people able to have lives, and they weren't just there to be a side character in somebody else's life. I wanted them to be at the forefront of the narrative, which is why Our Doris came about. I always say it wasn't supposed to be a book, and it wasn't. I would get stuck in writing bursts at the writers group and write something with Our Doris, and eventually it became expected, and eventually someone asked for a book, and then Joy forced my arm when Knutsford Library needed a male writer for an author panel, told them I was bringing a book out, and I wrote Our Doris incredibly quickly so that I could go, and I had a lot of events then. I just wanted older characters to have their time, and I think as well you do get this case of write what you know, and definitely the storytelling aspect of Our Doris, not necessarily with older characters in Heir to Murder, because yes, this is another book with older characters, which comes from the fact that we have a crime that's set 50 years in the past as well as one from today, and the people that are killed are older people. For An Heir to Murder, it was more because I wanted the link to Our Doris, but for me this still feels like a really young book because it's third person about Alice, and it always felt like Alice's book. Whilst there are all these older characters there, it was more her idea of how these older people are, how they behave, and maybe a different side of Partridge Mews. And the thing is, because I've been writing about older characters for so long, I worry that it's become kind of like seen as my shtick. Like, that's what I'm always going to do, write about older characters until I'm eventually one of them myself. I never intended to be writing Alice when Alice was younger than me, but also in getting older than Alice now, I'm able to think more about the way that she operates and how people are actually feeling. I wanted older people to have the spotlight. I think that there are still stories there that are about older characters, but I do have plans for stories with younger characters. I just haven't got to them yet. Next, I got a question from Kate Howe, which was, what made you decide to have Alice and Marmaduke work together as opposed to just having one of them investigate the crime? quite honestly, this came from me wanting to do this twist on what we were constantly being shown in fiction and media, which is the old stalwart of a detective, the grizzled male detective and his young female assistant coming together, and I didn't want it to be the man's perspective. I wanted it to be the woman solving the crime. I wanted it to be the young woman solving the crime. I knew that she had to have a connection to the police force, and originally the connection to the police force was just going to be Duke. Duke was there before Alice. When I was in year 9 and I wrote these 3 chapters of this ragamuffin type character, he was there, and I never intended to write with him again. I had put the character to bed, and then Alice Valentine came into my head. I wrote 3 chapters of Alice Valentine when I'd finished Our Doris, which is why she's at the end of Our Doris. You can see when I came up with the idea. And I had all these different pieces together. I was like, well, Marmaduke exists. Put him in here. At first, I wasn't really sure how it was going to work. Everything I did, it always felt like fake for them to be kind to each other. The first meeting of them in my head is Alice coming in and finding what a mess he's made of her auntie's cottage. And I was like, yeah, Alice isn't going to like this man. He's come into her auntie's house, he's ruined the place, and so she's kicking him out and she's throwing stuff at him, really. I don't know, there was something there. It happened to challenge what I thought was the stereotypical thing of having the older detective just kind of showing the younger detective the ropes. Alice isn't a detective, she's a sleuth. She's this young woman who has stumbled upon these murders quite by accident, and she'd be more than happy just to be the social worker she wants to be. Originally, there was going to be more of this social work aspect to the tale, with Alice going and being classed as Duke's social worker. But then she ended up getting sacked in the first chapter. And that was after I'd written my way in. I was like, oh no, she's losing her job here. She's losing her job. And originally, Auntie Magdalena was alive when I wrote those first 3 chapters, and they went to a cafe together, and she was going to have a bigger presence in the tale. And then I got rid of Auntie Magdalena. Basically, any character that I felt no longer fit the purposes of the story got killed off. So, unfortunately, that's what happened to her. And then, whilst I was writing, Alice and Duke just had this relationship with one another that no matter how hard I tried, no matter whether I wanted them to be kind to each other or not, they would just argue. And I had worried the entire time, because one of the things that I have always liked seeing is when the detectives hate each other and then eventually they reach this point of friendship. And it's not a enemies to lovers type thing, it's just these people who shouldn't work together kind of finally fitting with each other. And I always like eventually in the series where you see them working together but still being able to have these arguments. And I never thought I'd be able to do it. And then just whatever scene these 2 characters were in, they just start arguing. It was like I was the parent having to figure out how to get these children to communicate again. No matter whether I'd had Marmaduke go off and try and solve the crime on his own, or Alice go off and solve the crime on her own, they would always have ended up having to have somebody else there to bounce ideas off. Also, as I say, when I was originally setting out to do this, Duke was going to be the detective, the connection to the police force. I even had this idea to have Duke be seen as a police consultant so that he could get involved in other crimes. And then Jez came along. Jez arrived one day whilst I was sat at my grandmother's, and I happened to be writing dialogue that I thought was humorous, and Jez arrived the same day that Primrose arrived. When I wrote my first draft of this, Alice didn't have parents. I hadn't got that far. She didn't have a relationship with anybody. I didn't have anything. I didn't know anything about her. When it came to me finally knuckling down and writing this book, in 2018, I knew absolutely everything that there was to know about Alice, how she got on with her parents. I wanted a book where she had her parents and she got on with her parents, because I didn't want her to be tortured like all these other characters are. I wanted her to, for the most part, have led a bit of a privileged, really good lifestyle, but have absolutely no idea what she's doing with life. And that's what we got. I've no idea why she's so sarcastic and angry when she has the life that she has, but she is. I think that in this book, it's compounded by grief she's feeling, and I wonder what it'll be like as we move on down the line and Alice no longer has Magdalena to grieve over. I question, is bringing Duke into her life really her trying to seek some sort of relationship that she thinks she's lost? I don't know, but Alice and Duke just seem to work together. Valentine and Featherstone just sounded right. And that was how it happened. Like, it could have been any number of people. It could have been Arthur and Bill, who you never meet. It could have been Arthur and Mavis. It could have been Clementine. It could have been Magdalena. It could have been Alice, and it could have been Marmaduke on his own. They've all tried to tell this story in the past. Yeah, it was Alice who appeared out of nowhere, brought them all together, and managed to get the entire story told here. Another question I received regarding An Heir to Murder is whether the book is available in America. My book is available worldwide if you're able to read English, of course. It's an independent project, so no translation as of yet, which might be a good thing because there are some very regional things within these books. But yes, my book is available in America, and I'm told that whilst there are some things that American readers might not understand with this book, you can just Google them and it'll set you on the right path. My editor, Dane of Dane Reads, did do a good job at removing some things that were too regional and too northern for most people to understand outside of the UK. Anyway, I hope that answers that question for you. If you would like to purchase my books, then I do leave links in the description, and they're available most places books are sold. The Kindle edition's rather cheap too, I should say. If you have read An Heir to Murder and would like to discuss it, then please feel free to do so in the comments below. If you have any further questions, then this is also the place to ask them. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.